5, one at 1, and then so.
That's all.
Okay. First of all, let me more than formally thank Turan for inviting me in such really interesting company, and also for organising what seems to be working out as a really interesting and significant discussion, intellectually significant, certainly for me and I think for others as well. Let me, if I'm going to be time constrained, let me give you a summary so that if I'm cut off in the middle, you'll know where I got to, or you know where I'm heading towards. The financial crisis since 2008 has been analysed by critics of finance as a crisis of deregulation, financialisation, neoliberalism and speculation. I want to argue that there was indeed a crisis of liquidity in money and capital markets, but there was certainly a crisis of liquidity in money and capital markets, but this crisis in those money and capital markets cannot be understood without a serious critique of how capitalism functions, integrating the theory of production and distribution and the financing of capital accumulation. It's that last one that I'm particularly insistent on, within which the long-term debt markets are crucial. I think I'll go on to argue that the present crisis was initiated in the summer of 2008 by non-financial corporations that had become over-reliant on short-term borrowing to finance merger and takeover activity. And the squeeze on the liquidity of those non-financial corporations obliged them to reduce fixed investment. And it was this reduction in investment that transmitted the crisis to the rest of the economy. It was this reduction that has seriously impaired the ability of economies to support debt structures. So the debt problems arise essentially from that. So let me move on to the section, what I would call the critique of political economy. Let me start off with just some observations on Marx and capital and how these relate to today's capitalism. These remarks are very much influenced by a book that I'm working on, which will be coming out later this year, which is a translation of Tadeusz Kowalik's book on Rosa Luxemburg, Theory of Accumulation and Imperialism. This is a book which has been known in Italian and in Spanish, but was never translated into English. This will be the first English translation. There's a chapter in there on, more than one chapter on Marx's Capital. The essential point here is that, first of all, Marx did not complete Capital. He was going to rewrite volumes 2 and 3. The key lacuna is the key gap is in explaining the conditions for the realization of value, profits in particular, that he started looking at in volumes 2 and 3 of Capital. And what I want to highlight, what I hope will be apparent in my later remarks, is the inadequacy of the chapter which Engels added to Volume 3, again to Volume 3, on the stock market, which I think really doesn't do justice to the full significance of the stock market, in particular the long-term debt markets. You know, Engels in this chapter goes on about the problems of speculation in the markets, but he himself admits that the significance of all this is puzzling. Let me just explain what actually happened. What was it that set off Engels's remarks? The 1870s. Actually, they started off in the late 1860s, but there are a series of Companies Acts passed in the UK, passed also in many continental countries and in the US, to allow the routine establishment of companies with limited liability, financed by long-term debt and equity. Prior to that, if you wanted to establish a company with limited liability, you had to get it passed by Act of Parliament. Railways and canals were financed by those kinds of companies. But from then on, you could do this as a matter of routine. And I want to argue that this changed capitalist financing with two effects. In particular, first of all, it changed the nature of capitalist crisis. The classic capitalism, or the classic capitalist, up to the 1860s, I use the word classic. This is a term used by the great German-American Marxist Karl Niebel in his book. This classic capitalist financed his business out of his own pocket, or with short-term bank loans, or with bills, which were equally short-term. And this then gives rise to the classic 19th century crisis, where you have a bank crisis leading to a credit squeeze, leading to a failure of production, because the classic capitalist was investing, was financing with his short-term money or his own money, short-term credit or his own money, was financing long-term industrial assets, productive machinery. So, of course, it was vulnerable to the inability to roll over this debt. If they were unable to roll over the debt, then effectively he has to stop production, sell whatever he can to pay his debts, and then try and start all over again. And you find this debt crisis described in the classic works on bank crisis of that at that time. And the most famous, and I guess the most influential one, is the one by Toporowski, more famous, I guess, for his work on, or I guess probably known better in this company for his work on the schemes of reproduction, capital accumulation. Although his book on bank crises was enormously influential, even though it was never actually translated into English, it was influential on people like Hawtrey, Keynes, and so Hinman as well. After the 1870s, with the ability to use long-term debt or equity finance, capitalists could match the financing of their enterprises to the duration of the capital equipment. Is what comes to be known in the literature as funding. However you finance your undertaking, you then organise the issue of a long-term bond which replenishes your reserves and whose duration matches the duration on of your capital equipment. And it's for this reason that, for example, the authors with genuine insight at that time, people like Keynes and others, insisted that it's this long-term rate of interest that's far more important than the short-term rate of interest in determining corporate finance. There was a second consequence, which is it actually changed the structure of capitalism. What happened was that if companies could issue equity, then you could actually, it becomes easy to take over a company merely through buying its long-term debts or buying its the company's stock or equity. So you have a very rapid, very active period of mergers and acquisitions, which results in a monopoly or finance capital. In other words, large corporations, the first period of what came to be known in America, for example, as the robber barons period of corporate capitalism, linked to this ability to buy up your competitors through the stock market. And again, this needs to be contrasted with the Marshallian approach, which you find in the textbooks now, where monopoly arises either because there's a natural monopoly or there are industries with increasing returns to scale, but not because companies have bought out their competitors in the stock market. And then the more interesting development for macroeconomics that arises from this are business cycles, and this one of the something which is you find in Hilferding's Finance Capital. Hilferding was the first person who put forward this idea that capitalism becomes divided into corporations, which is the monopoly finance capital part, who operate through the capital using the capital markets, and competitive firms, or what we would nowadays call small and medium-sized enterprises, who can't or don't engage in this kind of merger and acquisition, corporate refinancing activity. And business cycles arise essentially because SMEs may do the investment, but it's a monopoly capitalists who obtain the profits. And in connection with, say, some of the discussion before lunch, and I guess some of the later discussion, it's actually one of the reasons why I think looking at aggregate rates of profit can be misleading, because what you do when you look at aggregate rates of profit is you're aggregating out this fundamental difference, which then between competitive firms and monopoly firms, which then affects the dynamics of the business cycle. In the financial markets, what you get is firms then overcapitalize. You issue excess capital to hold liquid assets as a hedge against their long-term financial liabilities just in case they can't make the payments on their financial obligations. And in the capital market, there is a growing need for re-intermediation. In other words, credit becomes focused on the markets for long-term securities in order to maintain the liquidity of those long-term securities. So you have, portfolios of long-term securities have to be hedged in some way with short-term assets, and hence from the 1870s onwards you get this massive increase in shorter-term intermediation, which is shorter-term financial assets which are held in order to hedge long-term assets. So an enormous increase in credit, which is connected with the liquidity of the longer-term securities. And I would say it's this connection with the long-term debt markets that I think is behind what's sometimes referred to as financialization. The general observation that there is much more debt in the system. Yes, there is, but that much more debt has the function not necessarily of indebting everyone in the system, although some of this is happening, but it has an important function in maintaining the liquidity of the long-term securities markets. So you get from there the impact of this finance on political economy. You find coming up first of all with Veblen's theory of business enterprise, the first analysis of the new kind of financial crises. The financial crises focused on the stock market, no longer just bank crises. As the other key figure in this, Keynes, quite clearly in the general theory, making this famous distinction between the state of long-term expectations, which is supposed to determine business investment, and the short-term expectations of the stock market. For that matter, his liquidity preference theory of money is simply a theory of that the rate of interest is determined in those markets for long-term securities and no longer in just in the money markets. What happens in reaction to Keynesian analysis is a certain Marxist retrogression into Ricardian socialism and under-consumptionism. The belief that, yes, what's distinctive about Marxism is the labour theory of value, the notion that all value is based on labour, which you don't find in Keynes. So theory of production, and then an under-consumptionism I'll come on to later on. Under-consumptionism, I mean in a very specific, in the narrow sense, not in the broad sense, used by Schumpeter and a lot of other people, of merely deficient aggregate demand. I mean literally, there is not enough consumption demand in the economy. You have a certain compromise between the Marx and Keynes position in the social structural accumulation, the regulation, or the regulationist recognition that it's possible to get state expenditure if you have a sufficiently large fiscal deficit to balance this kind of underconsumptionism. You can stabilize capitalism. What happens with the post-Keynesian alternative, generally the Keynesian alternative, is a general focus on fiscal policy to maintain aggregate demand. Latterly, you have a lot of discussion around wage-led growth, the wage share and so on, associated with Oslo Monoranist, Engelbert Stockhammer, and other recent post-Keynesians, really which is a form of underconsumptionism, the idea that the problem is that the workers are not being paid the full value of their labour, and this acts as a constraint on demand in the economy. And what I think is key is the limitation of this, of underconsumptionism, is that it overlooks the key role of investment or capital accumulation in the realisation of profits. This I think is the key lesson or key conclusion that comes out of that whole debate that goes from really Rosa Luxemburg through Koletsky, Sweezy, and so on. Sweezy after he recovered from his underconsumptionist phase. Let me now move on to my account or my version of what I think happened in the crisis. And as my preliminary remarks have indicated, for me, this is all bound up with what happens in corporate finance, because it's, as I'll try to show, it's corporate finance, balance sheet operations of corporations which determine what happens in capitalism. In general, in virtually all capitalist countries, the difference between the monopoly finance capital, the corporations, and the small and medium-sized enterprises is that the corporations do the vast bulk of private sector business investment. It comes from them with the very simple reason that they have the money for this, and they have the capacity to finance this. Small and medium-sized enterprises are responsible for the majority of employment, so they have a very important employment function, a function in the labour market, but are not really that significant in terms of fixed investment. So if you want to understand the crisis of accumulation, you have to look what's happened to the business, to large corporations. And if you look at what happened to them, I just have here the 6 largest multinational companies, leaving out the car industry. I put those in because I got the data for them. Lafarge, Rio Tinto, Cemex, ArcelorMittal, Tata, Xstrata. Very interesting, 2 of these, Tata and Cemex, are from the developing countries. Didn't stop them from becoming massive corporations. ArcelorMittal, of course, dominates the steel industry outside China, that is. All of these had very large net short-term debts totaling $136 billion. Now here's the curious thing about them. The debts had been incurred in mergers and acquisition, not in fixed investment. The standard approach to business cycles from the Austrians, including Keynesians, Minsky, is that the business cycle arises because there is overinvestment. These companies didn't overinvest. They indebted themselves in order to make themselves extremely large. ArcelorMittal, of course, taking over, hoovering up steel companies in Europe, Cemex hoovering up the cement industries in different countries, Tata in the case of the motor cars and other manufacturing. Now the strategy behind all this was to make for these corporations to become extremely large, to have an even more dominating position in their markets. And the idea was that they were going to refinance this into cheap equity in the stock market. In the event, what happened was that in the summer of 2008, the stock market stock markets around the world became seriously liquid, partly because of the problems in the short-term money markets, which were affecting stock market investors such as hedge funds and so on, and private equity, but in particular because it was known that the response of the banking authorities to the crisis would be to force banks to recapitalize. And you knew that there was going to be a whole string of banks waiting to issue new equity or some kind of long-term debt. What happened in the event was that there was a struggle by the corporations to get outside investors. Warren Buffett gets a string of businessmen outside his door. But in the end, what they all did was they cut their planned fixed investment by an average of around 60%. It was between half and two-thirds. And the result was the predictable recession, not just the predictable recession, but then the subsequent problems in the debt markets, because the business investment is one way in which corporations' liquidity gets circulated through the rest of the economy. And so it affects consumers, affected the housing market, affected the economy as a whole. So this leads me to my conclusion, I hope in good time, that it wasn't Lehman Brothers, although Lehman Brothers was a nice, dramatic interlude in the whole affair. Lehman Brothers, in my view, was not that important. It wasn't government debt as the crisis then morphs in Europe into a crisis, and later on in the US, into a crisis of government indebtedness. A crisis, I should say, with Simon on my left here, crisis in the sense of difficulties in selling corporate government debt. It was actually capitalism. It was the breakdown of capital accumulation, caused by this complex way in which corporations manage their balance sheets in an era where they're financing with long-term debt, or trying to finance with long-term debt, and equity, where in markets that, precisely because it's long-term debt or irredeemable equities, that are vulnerable to problems of illiquidity. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jan. That was excellent. That we time to discuss some major issues. Certainly, your points caused me to think with regard to my own paper. Now, I would say the summary of Jan's is that the various changes in the structure of capitalism led to changes in method of corporate finance, and this cannot be ignored in understanding the process. Now, questions, comments? People
Quick clarification question, if I may. When you're talking about the numbers you're giving, are they for the U.S. economy, or are you talking about EU, or is this like when you say the investment went down by 60%, for example, on average?
No, the investment of those corporations.
of those six.
Of those six.
Only local.
Yes, yeah. Because I think they're the most. Now, the precise distribution is not clear. I suspect if you looked at, say, the German corporations, you'd find the situation was rather different. None of these corporations were German, and Germany has a very concentrated corporate financing structure. That, I think, is another, possibly a different, another aspect of this research which should be done.
Simon?
Thanks, Jan. I have an apology, a comment, and then a question.
Just the first.
The apology is to you all because my presentation tomorrow will also focus on financial markets, and that's not in the paper or the half paper that I circulated. Secondly, the comment. I think you're absolutely right to focus on debt markets. I am, however, very skeptical of your thesis for two reasons. One is, I don't think the chronology works in terms of the sequence of events that you describe. I don't think that's the way it happened. But secondly, in traditional Michael Lewis fashion of very large numbers when one talks about finance, $136 billion is not very much money in the financial world. I reckon it's something like 5% of US surplus value produced each year. It just doesn't seem to me big enough to cause the sort of events that subsequently happened. But I'll talk more about that tomorrow. So I don't want to pursue that, but just to say then, I think you're absolutely right to focus on debt markets and how they operate. My question though is slightly different, which is really about where we are now. You talked about the 1870s Companies Acts, and one thing that you didn't say, but I think you probably can draw a connection quite easily, is the way in which the passage of those acts was a response to the collapse of Over-End and Gurney in 1866, which was the biggest financial crisis the capitalist world had known up to that point. And I think you can trace a connection between that and the restructuring of those of credit and debt markets that were consequences upon the passing of the Companies Acts. Similarly, and this is well known, Glass-Steagall and all the surrounding legislation was certainly passed in response to the 1929 financial debacle and the subsequent bank failures after 1930. So my question is, if that is true, if the 1870s Companies Acts were a response to the Overend and Gurney crash, at least in large part, if Glass-Steagall, etc., was a response to 1929, at least in large part, what do you think are the equivalent developments today? And this is not a question you particularly talked about, but I wonder what your views on that might be.
Okay. Jan?
Yes, I put up the figure of 136 billion. I don't think that figure actually matters. What's important about it is that it had an impact on the investment strategy of those corporations, and that's the key factor. And that if you look at the, it's difficult to disentangle this in the from the official data, because the official data, if you look for fixed investment, they'll give you household investment, they'll include household investment in residential real estate, and things like this, which quite clearly are not relevant for these purposes. If you just look at investment, business investment in fixed capital, you see a significant decline that sets in around this time. On Glass-Steagall and the effect of financial regulation, I'm not sure that this has that big an impact. I mean, the Glass-Steagall had been abolished. I mean, the last chunk of it went in 1999. Really, a good 8 years before this crisis happened. And in any case, as far as the corporations were concerned, it didn't affect them because they did their financing offshore. It was an obvious way to get around this. So I don't think that this, I'm not convinced that regulation or re-regulation is a major factor. Where Overend Gurney was significant was, yes, it showed how serious were the problems for banks, but more generally for businesses. If you didn't have if you couldn't set up joint stock companies, or if you didn't have joint stock banking, but then that reinforces the fact that with joint stock banking and with joint stock companies, the form, at least, of the, if not the exploitative nature of the capitalist gain changes.
I want to come back on that,
Yeah,
because I think Jan hasn't understood my question. Maybe I didn't.
Let me just say one sentence in the question. I think Sam's asking, what are the equivalent regulatory steps now? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, that is, there was regulatory change in the 1870s consequent upon Overend and Gurney crash, which had major implications for how capitalism functioned. There was regulatory change in the early 1930s, which had major implications for how capitalism functioned. My question was, in your view, is there similar regulatory change today? Has it happened? Is it planned? Or is it missing?
I think I would have to think about this. I seriously don't. I still think that the fundamental distinction is between corporations which have access to the capital market, the long-term debt markets, and the small and medium-sized firms which have to operate competitively. But I guess I would have to think about it. It's the two institutions that seem to me to be of recent provenance in these markets, which will be hedge funds and private equity, were important innovations, but I don't think were as important as the emergence of that divide.
I think Al was next, and then I'll get David.
So this is a question, I don't know if I didn't quite understand and you already spoke to this, or if you didn't speak to it, and then I'm just asking what you think of it. You put forward particularly that the debt built up by the mergers and acquisitions was the kickoff, and in particular you said it's not the typical investment thing of Hayek, Keynes, and Minsky kicking off the business cycle. And what I wanted to know, business cycles have changed somewhat starting in the 1980s in the US, the 90s, the one at the beginning of the 90s, the one at the beginning of the 2000s. They weren't particularly deep, but they were much slower in recovery. They were much more jobless in recovery and slower in recovery. And I mean, this meltdown, of course, technically was a business cycle. I mean, the cycle came, but it was turned into a particularly deep, turned into a crisis, the Great Recession. And so what I'm asking is, are you suggesting that, because the 1980s was a time of very big mergers and acquisitions, one of the biggest up to that time, are you suggesting that something fundamentally has changed in business cycles in general? Are you suggesting that, because these other guys had the investment idea, the typical idea of a business cycle, are you suggesting that this buildup of debt for mergers and acquisitions is something which now enters into all business cycles and is part of the reason that they're being modified? Or are you strictly just talking about the role that mergers and acquisitions and the debt buildup played in the meltdown of 2008?
Yeah, one of the, yes, I think there is something fundamental. Maybe this addresses also Simon's last point as well. I think that one of the fundamental changes that arises with mergers and acquisitions is growing private sector bureaucracies, and this is linked to something which I know is not much discussed in these kinds of circles, and that is the growing middle class. That is people who are employed in private and public bureaucracies, public services, accountancy, and all the rest of it. Their demand becoming increasingly important for stabilising the economy. And that I get, it's this middle class it's this middle class rather than necessarily the working class that then get involved in this residential housing boom that features large in most accounts of the financial crisis. That I think is a major factor. And the second one is, of course, the role of government. Maybe I downplayed a little bit the fundamental change towards having such a huge 40% or more of total demand in the economy being government demand. But that is an important factor, and it's an important stabilising factor as well.
Just follow. So you're suggesting this not just for the crisis, but this is a change which is infecting business cycles in general?
Yes, in general. So over the long term, you have these kind of trends stabilising.
David?
Oh, yeah, just a technical,
Okay.
when people talk, can you please put the micro on, because
Yeah.
if it's being,
Please do,
if
yes.
it's being broadcast, it means that you cannot be heard if you don't put that.
But maybe I don't want people.
That's a very important insight, actually.
I've got yours on.
No, but this is not a contribution. I'm just saying to the people here, please put the thing on when you talk.
Okay, David?
Turn your mic off.
My mic's on.
You have to turn it off. You not only have to turn it on, then you have to turn it off. Your paper presents an account of what started the crisis in the summer of 2008. And it focuses on 6 transnational corporations. There's pretty wide agreement that the crisis really began in the US. So to supplement the data that you presented, wouldn't it be important to, if you want to provide stronger support for your account, to show some data on the US economy, such as is there evidence that large non-financial corporations were trying to borrow and couldn't get their financing needs met in the US? Look at what happened to interest rates in that period, to really make a convincing account that it came from the source that you've described.
These multinational corporations were raising funds in a had equity issues in a number of different financial centres. So there was no, including the US. It wasn't just that, and I'm not denying that there were not problems in the residential housing market and and then the problems with mortgage-backed securities and Lehman Brothers and so on. What I want to argue is that these things on their own might have caused something that like the long-term capital management crisis that occurred around 2000, from which the economy apparently recovered, or going back even earlier, the 1987 stock market crash. What's significant about, I think, what happened in 2008 was there was something else which caused this, which meant that what might have been an isolated financial market hiccup with problems for a marginal section, because let's face it, the people affected by the housing crisis at that time, it was tragic for them, but in aggregate demand terms, they were marginal. What was significant was what was being done by the larger corporations, and I would, I myself would be very, very happy to broaden out this research to look at other, what was happening elsewhere. I have seen data for the US, which does indicate a sort of decline in investment. But we should also remember that the US is a low investing economy. The US, it comes back to what was said earlier about the profits of US capitalists. They come from all over the world. The activities, their operations in the US are not necessarily that important.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. It's crack record. Hit me.
Sorry, Ian?
Track record time again. I'm very much welcome what I see as in part in your paper an attempt to get
at the relationship between the restructuring and accumulation of productive capital and its interaction with the evolving financial system. But I would very much like to see that extended, not just to be focused upon the crisis, but the whole 30 years period of neoliberalism. In a sense, that's what was previously attempted to be captured by the notion of how stakeholder capitalism has an impact on long-term levels and efficacy of investment. That's just my first comment. The second is, although this is not my field in any way whatsoever, is to try and answer Simon's question. And here I draw upon the work,
I'm sorry, it's not your field.
I know, of Andrew Haldane. And basically the answer is, you know, the deregulatory genie is out of the bottle, and there's no way it's going back in again. And he gives these wonderful figures. You know, the financial system was not unregulated. There were 3 regulators for every US bank. And then, I'm just picking out these figures he gives. Just to implement Basel III compliance over the 350 European banks, he says, would require 70,000 new jobs in regulation. You know, it ain't going to happen. Right? So, the idea, I mean, I think your question was not innocent, wasn't your question?
No, I mean, there are proposals in the air. For instance, Martin Wolf and 100% fractional reserve banking, for example, would be theoretically a way to go. You can't see it happening. But it seems to me that the scale of the financial damage was sufficient that there will be a set of responses. The question is, have we seen them yet? What is likely to happen? That's all. I didn't have any hidden motive. I think it's an interesting question.
From my innocent point of view, uninformed, I defer to all those experts in banking and banking regulation. The nature of the institutions, the nature of the complexity and proliferation and multiplicity of markets makes, again, I'll give you another quote, the current Dodd-Frank Act of 2010 has 8,843 pages for the rule book, just covering 1/3 of the rules. You know, they cannot do this. I mean, it is...
If I can just make a brief comment. I believe
This is a question.
Privately, Andrew, after he spoke, I said to him, is there a solution? And he said, yes, nationalize the finance.
Just move to
Ricardo.
I am really upset by your microphone. I'm really upset by his anti-Ricardian position. It was a joke. As you imagine, I like your paper very much, but indeed I like 2 papers, because in my view you presented 2 papers, and I think there is a relation between the 2, but it's not clear which one, because the first one was a general outlook at Marxism, post-Keynesian, etc. The second one was very much focused on 2008, maybe even half of 2008. So it would be nice to understand what is the strong connection between the 2. I think there are some connections, but there is the risk of thinking that the connection is too strong. I agree with most of your points. Let me start with an anecdote. When Marx was asked by a journalist why he didn't finish Capital, a British journalist, why you don't put out the second and third volume, his answer was, there is a huge crisis now here in England. I cannot finish my book until that crisis is over and I know what has happened. This means that yes, Marx is incomplete, yes, the third volume of Finance is an Engels construction. We actually don't know what Marx would say after 100 centuries of crisis, regulatory changes, etc. So I agree on that. I agree on your criticism of underconsumption. I agree on your criticism of Ricardian Marxism. For me, most Marxists are just defending Marx against Swafians, saying that they have surplus labor against surplus. This is, in my view, a truly Ricardian position. Not neo-Ricardian, Ricardian. Going back to Ricardo. I agree with you that underinvestment is the key. That means it is important what is driving effective demand and what is the autonomous demand. I agree completely on the relevance of long-term debts and corporate finance. But there are details, and not so much details that I am worried about. First, let me do the Vicky check. When you invited me in SOAS, I said like you that there is the laboratory of value in Marx and not in Keynes. And she said to me, you are wrong, and she's right. There is a footnote in which Keynes says, I agree with the classicals that all value comes from labor. So something more must be said. In the end, I would agree with you, but this is the detail. Yes, everything is not much a details. It's crucial. But first, he had the idea of a kind of socialization of capital stabilizing capitalism. All the authors we love, Luxemburg, Sweezy, I would even put Powermatic. They define themselves against everything. So the point is what was going on labor, on economic policy, etc. So here I think that you are raising important points, but they should become a paper in its own. And they would be less nice about Sweezy. Because Sweezy is not the same as Luxemburg or Kalinski. Because Sweezy in the 70s just didn't use anymore the term underconsumption and said that the contradictions came from the problem of realizing use values in exchange values. It's not, in my view, the same thing. The second part of the paper is very rich, but it is too close to September 2008. You know, for me, the story begins in January 2007. For 6 months, financial bloggers were sending emails and documents saying a big crisis is coming. March 2007, there was the talk about the Minsky moment. The crisis began in June, July, and August 2007. That bubble collapsed, but another bubble, maybe more bubbles, but another big bubble started, if I remember well. And it was the raw materials and oil. And there are a lot of interesting stories that the crisis in September was due to the fact that the hedge funds and those investing there had to go out. The interesting part of the story, however, is that that bubble didn't drive anymore the economy as it was before. Before, bubbles went into in-depth consumption or some kind of demand. Now it was not true. So, it is not best to start from the fact that in the US the crisis was already going on, not only financial, but also real. And a lot of firms went into a forced indebtedness. That is, it is not important to put Steingold into the picture. Last thing is just a line. I don't believe in 100% fractional banking. I think that not only Minsky, but also Keynes, also Marx, thought that what is good about capitalism is or are the speculative positions. Marx was very hard with those who thought that you can have good markets, good money, and not capital. Ricardian social. If you have money, you will have capital and the capitalist. So that's the thing. If you have 100% fractional banking and it works, it means that you are in a stationary economy. And capitalism can never be stationary, in the long term, of course.
Okay, Jan, there's several points there. Let me just give a forewarning. We have about 12 minutes left until, so we're going to stop it for the coffee break at 10 minutes to 10 minutes to 3. So if you want to comment on that,
Yeah.
it's like, okay.
Yeah, I actually haven't really that much to say as usual with Ricardo. My response is yes, I agree. I would emphasise that I'm not saying that there weren't problems in the financial markets before 2008. There quite clearly were, and the build-up, the short-term borrowing, the build-up of short-term borrowing, usually a build-up of short-term borrowing in a corporation, engaging in purchase of long-term assets is usually a sign that they can't access the long-term debt markets as efficiently as they would like. So that in itself, this phenomenon may have arisen earlier. And certainly in 2007 there were these difficulties. But as I say, there had been such difficulties in the markets before, long-term debt management and so on. As far as regulatory responses, yes, because I think one of the delusions arising out of the crisis is that because we see a narrative of the crisis focused around finance, because those are the markets into which all of these developments feed, that somehow if we change the financial markets, we can change the nature of an unstable capitalism, and it doesn't work like that. And so yes, I agree with you completely.
Yeah, I like the paper a lot because I think it draws attention to one of the issues in what I find very important in Marx, which is what he calls the contradictory unity between production and realization, as mediated through credit markets. However, I'm less likely to support your argument that what you're talking about is the mechanism. I think there are lots of other mechanisms which are involved in a parallel kind of way. For instance, what went on in housing markets. Put very simply, the housing market issue is partly that credit, finance capital extends money to developers to build houses, and then it extends money to people to buy houses. That is, capital operates on both the supply and demand of housing at the same time. In exactly the same way that Marx complains about what happens in labour markets, that capital operates on both sides, so it operates on both sides. In housing markets, it's very easy to see how out of that you can get a bubble forming, because there's excess capital in capital markets, and they lend to developers, and then they lend to consumers, and the thing just goes round and round and round. On that, if I can be permitted, there's a little story I should tell. The New York housing market is 60% renter. In 2007, 10% of the rental accommodation in New York City was bought out by private equity firms. What did they do? They went in and they played inflated costs for something like Stuyvesant Town, very inflated costs, with the idea that they could take the rents and bring them out of rent stabilized into a free rental market and make a dead killing out of that. And this was their strategy. And there are various ways in which you can do that, one of which is, of course, to turn the heating off the whole winter. And by the time everybody's left, then you can go back in and sort of we're doing things like this, not in Stuyvesant Town, but in other units. And what merger and acquisitions are about, and what acquisitions of this kind are about, are in fact about asset stripping. And therefore, in my view, this is about accumulation by dispossession. And it's interesting that in primitive accumulation, Marx talks about the credit system as being a primary means of primitive accumulation, but it's a primary means, in my language, of accumulation by dispossession. Now, Marx makes an interesting comment in chapter 15 of volume 3, which is that a falling rate of profit will generate a new round of primitive accumulation, and that therefore accumulation by dispossession is going to be one of the responses to any signs of a falling rate of profit. And the fact that you're picking up that actually what the companies are doing is going into mergers and acquisitions rather than into production suggests that they're having difficulty making profit in production, and that they're therefore going to go in for asset stripping. So this is again one of the things that was beginning to emerge. Now, what happened to Tishman, who bought...
Simon come in? We only have 5 minutes.
Tishman, who bought Stuyvesant Village, couldn't turn over his debt in 2008, 2009, 2010, and actually went and filed bankruptcy on the whole thing in 2010, and it's now reverted to the bank, which, and it's interesting, the bank that organised the leverage buyout of Stuyvesant Village is the one called New York Community Bank.
Simon, I'll show you how much I appreciate your comments. I have a comment, but I'll withhold mine. You can work on the last 5 minutes.
I want to make a comment on what Al said, because I think that's really important. The issue is whether the US business cycle has changed. And one of the reasons for thinking it might have done is the phenomenon of jobless growth that we've experienced the last 20 years or so. The other is that if Okun's law had continued to work, then unemployment would have risen much, 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 much more in the US than in fact it did rise in 2008-9. So, that prima facie seems to say things have changed. There's a very interesting article by Basu and Foley in the Cambridge Journal this year or last year, where they focus precisely on this. And the issue is an interesting one and actually relates to a lot of the issues that are underlying here, which is how do you measure the output of a corporation that doesn't produce anything physical? And so, for instance, a finance company, that's not the only possibility. There are lots and lots of possibilities. And it turns out what US statisticians do is, whereas they measure the output of an auto company in terms of the number of autos produced, that's relatively easy, it's physical, you count them. What they do when they get to corporations whose output they cannot measure because there's no physical analog at all, is they switch away from value-added and output measures and they switch to income measures. And in particular, they say, okay, what does government contribute? That's the taxes on production and imports item. What do workers contribute? That's the wages item. And then what does capital contribute? That's the gross operating surplus. Now, if you have a situation in which you have massive growth of income inequality, that's going to get translated into the output measures of these companies producing intangible outputs. If you strip that out of your measures if you adjust GDP and switch and ignore those intangibles, then it appears the business cycle hasn't changed at all. And so therefore, what they're looking at is, what they're focusing on is precisely how these companies producing apparently intangible outputs have appear to change what has actually happened. But if you look at companies producing material outputs, nothing much has changed. And that's an interesting way of looking at it, because...
the last 2 minutes, please.
Because it bears on the sentence.
2 minutes left, Simon, and we're going to
bears on the issue of production and productive labour too.
There are only 2 minutes left, and they're going to go to Jan.
All I will say is I will thank you for your comments, and I will think about them.
Okay, Simon, you have some time left.
No, the issue that raises for us, it's the same issue, is, well, if we're looking at productive and unproductive labour, then that's precisely the same issue that Foley and Basil are looking at, but, you know, pitched in a slightly different framework, and it's an issue for us as well.
Do you want to say something? No. All right, I think we're trying to catch up so we get back to 6 o'clock for the
Reception.
Well, we have a 15-minute
Cocktail.
buffer because.
Yeah, and so what I'm suggesting is the following, which leaves everybody with the same amount of time that cuts the coffee rate. So if we can come back at 3:25 for David, and then he can have the amount of time that's scheduled.
2:25.
You mentioned.
That's in 35 minutes.
We want
But